So in 1986, the group around the Detroit-based paper Fifth Estate wrote of the effort to develop a critical analysis of the technological structure of Western civilization, combined with a reappraisal of the indigenous world and the character of primitive and original communities. In this sense, they wrote, we are primitivists. Fifth Estate, alongside papers and journals such as Green Anarchy, Species Traitor, and Green Anarchist, as well as figures such as Jacques Camartte, Freddie Perlman, John Zerzan, John Moore, and David Watson, are part of an intellectual political current variously known as civilization critique, green anarchism, primitivism, neo-primitivism, and anarcho-primitivism. This current flourished most in the period running between the mid-1980s and 1990s, and was subsequently encompassed and partially eclipsed by the anarchist-leaning alternative globalization current. While anarcho-primitivist thinkers are marginal figures today, the themes they grappled with are as relevant as ever and are being extended by a number of contemporary critical scholars. In many respects, anarcho-primitivism appears to occupy a position at the most extreme edge of left extremisms, with its exhilarating, though often poetic, critique of the entirety of civilization through the Neolithic revolution onwards, and its entirely non-contemporaneous desire for a future primitive mode of being. So this talk that I'm giving today is part of a broader project that I'm undertaking with Chamsi Olajali, and unfortunately for all of you, Chamsi Olajali is the specialist really on this topic that I'm talking about today. So when it gets to question time, I might just collapse like a soggy bag of old chips or something like that. I don't know, but we'll see how far we get. So as I say, this is part of a larger project for us, which has the working title Figures of Extremism, Left Communism and Utopia. So we position ourselves here in this work against what we call the extremism industry, which is a site of popular cultural, political and intellectual production, which is haunted by the spectre of extremism. So this ideological project categorizes a broad range of phenomena as being extremist, and this includes Islamic radicals, right-wing nationalists, Antifa, deep green activists, and the ruling elites of rogue states. We ask why, in the present moment, extremism has become such a prominent object of concern. And we also turn to historical examples to argue that what is considered extremist at one point in time, for instance, the 19th century struggles for female suffrage or the abolition of slavery, how something which might be deemed extremist at one point in time can become, with time, common sense and widely accepted features of the political sphere. So we consider the extremism industry to operate as a prohibition on thinking, a means of discrediting any political project that seeks a way of life other than that offered by the status quo. So against this prohibition, we retrieve and revalorize elements from historically marginalized and extremist currents of left communist thought. So this thought offers critical and utopian optics through which to evaluate both contemporary capitalism and also left history, and to also consider the possible forms that communist society might take. So anarcho-primitivism is, for us, an example of an extreme left communist current that deserves critical evaluation. So in turning to anarcho-primitivism, we explore a set of stark, recurrent argumentative polarities that function as a critical and utopian constellation of figures and concerns, such as nature-culture, spontaneity and artifice, instinct versus science, wholeness versus fragmentation, and community versus atomization. So we analyse these themes in today's talk by first turning to two predominant generations of influences which are deployed and synthesized within anarcho-primitivism, and second, by discussing axiomatic primitivist efforts to separate their position from modernizing leftism. And this is both in its Marxist and anarchist currents that's sort of trying to separate itself from here. We then lay out the anarcho-primitivist depiction of civilization, Leviathan, or the mega machine that they oppose, and subsequently consider the contestatory and utopian contentions posed against the systemic totality that they're critical of. So while surveying some of the often brutal, critical responses to anarcho-primitivism, we nonetheless suggest that the relevance of certain dimensions of the primitivist case, and we trace these through the work of some contemporary scholars on the left as we come towards the close of this talk. So a distinctive anarcho-primitivist current emerged in the 1970s, visible in Jacques Camart's 1973 essay, The Wandering of Humanity, and in the fifth, The State's reorientation later in that decade. So prior to these developments are two major, though somewhat disparate, generations of influences and intellectual interlocuteurs. So the first of these is located between the late 19th century and the First World War, and it draws on romantic and counter-enlightenment critiques of modernity. So we have here the celebration of humanity's creative, intuitive, and emotional capacities. We have people as artists rather than workers or consumers. An emphasis on the collective good and strong social bonds, the recognition of the past as the living foundation of the present, and society as a complex, interdependent, organic whole. Nature as vital and irreducible to a series of physical, mechanically operating objects, and concern with industrialization, urbanization, and the growing pervasiveness of the cash nexus as something which corrodes authentic individuality and community. I'm going to have to apologize in advance. Chamsy and I end up just getting really into listing stuff. So you can start throwing paper at me as I keep cranking through long lists like this as the talk goes. Anyway, Marx is a very crucial figure here. His early work, of course, is marked by concern with workers' alienation from human essence, the social impact that comes from the division of labour, and the city-country divide. And the German ideology offers a distinctively green, romantic vision of communism: hunting, fishing, shepherding, and critical criticism. Counter to notions of an epistemological break, aspects of these critical and utopic themes persisted in Marx's work and influenced diverse Marxist currents. William Morris's novel, News from Nowhere, for instance, portrays industrial society as an increasingly uninhabitable desert, in his words, as noisy, polluted, ugly, in which humans are being enslaved by machines. In explaining his conversion to socialism, Morris states that, apart from my desire to produce beautiful things, the leading passion of my life has been and is a hatred of modern civilization. His vision of socialism finds its reference in the past, in the period between the 12th and 16th centuries, and he calls for an abundance of open spaces, an exit from the age of inventions, and the celebration of craftsmanship and of the workshop as a school of art. In his great utopian novel, Morris imagines a post-revolutionary anthropological transformation of people who become beautiful, graceful, carefree, without jealousy or acquisitiveness. In a word, they become innocents. So Morris is quite unusual in his approach to Marxism at this time, with the anarchism of this period more frequently associated with an extended critique of modernity. And this includes the critique of Marxism's submissions to modern ills, such as productivism. So anarchism has always questioned large-scale, centralized, highly mechanized industry and opposed the Enlightenment belief that liberation might be won through epistemological, technological triumph over nature. There are a number of conceptual affinities between anarchism and primitivism: that the best part of human history was pre-state, that the acquisitions of the modern age were evil, and an attachment to spontaneous order against the artificiality of the state. More concretely, Proudhon's work enshrines the small-town values of peasant and artisan. In Bakunin, meanwhile, alongside the Promethean contention that humanity must master the natural world, which involves the absolute authority of science, we also find a critique of the belief in the infallible authority of men of science. Both positivists and Marxists, who Bakunin called the scientific socialists, are viewed as potentially forming a new privileged scientific and political class. So against this scientistic tendency, Bakunin espouses a vitalistic elevation of instinct, passion, art and life, calling for a democratic reformation of science. Different impulses are found in the anarchism of Kropotkin and Landau. Landau, for instance, looked to peasant traditionalism, art and artisanal production, combining collectivist, spiritual, and folkish attachments to organic and harmonious community, which he set against urban and industrial life, along with Nietzschean voluntarism, literary bohemianism, and romantic individualism. And the Marxism, which was institutionalized at the Erfurt Congress in 1891, was anathema to such thought, with Landau branding these Marxists as the progeny of steam, as seeking to replace spirit with science, and they are, in his words, scientific swindlers, cold, hollow, spiritless. So against Marxism's progressivism, Landau depicted his age as being one of deep decay. So we can also delineate a loose, diverse second generation of influences at work in contemporary anarcho-primitivism, which appeared after the Second World War and runs through to the mid-1960s, with the Frankfurt School being quite important here. So Zerzan, for instance, draws on the dialectic of enlightenment alongside Adorno's critique of mass consumer culture, pseudo-individuality, inauthenticity, and standardization. He also worked for Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history, drawing on its images of progress as catastrophe, civilization as barbarism, redemption as being a tiger's leap into the past, and its critique of a socialism that recognizes only progress in the mastery of nature. Marcuse's 1964 One-Dimensional Man also contains themes congruent with anarcho-primitivism. In particular, the contention that technological advancement domesticates dissent. Another unorthodox Marxian forebear to anarcho-primitivism, central to the pioneering work of Jacques Camartte, is Amadeo Bodega, who was the first leader of the Italian Communist Party. As a firm historical materialist, holding that material conditions shape consciousness, Bodega opposed the Soviet Union on the grounds that it was, in fact, a variety of capitalism. He was also resolutely anti-parliamentary and anti-democratic, a position stemming from his rejection of bourgeois individualism. Communism, if realized, would be, in his words, the affirmation of social man, the joyous harmony of social man. Strikingly, Bodega wrote a number of pioneering articles in the 1950s on the connection between capitalism and environmental degradation. In these texts, Bodega criticizes the modern obsessions of science, technology, and production. He considers the disasters and chain reactions provoked by the convulsive dynamic of what he called supercapitalism. For instance, deforestation became a major concern of his. And he rejected the agglomerated monsters, in his words, that arose from urbanism. And he agonizes over the impact of machines on human beings, and he critiques the general capitalist neglect of future generations. A third, more anarchistic strand of influence is found in the work of Anglo-American thinkers, such as Herbert Reed, Alex Comfort, George Woodcock, and Paul Goodman, all of whom evince a romantic anarchism, one that stresses authenticity, instinct, the art-life connection, participation, sensuousness, and community. In Goodman, for instance, we again encounter critiques of urbanization and technology, along with laments for lost community, set against participation and self-rule, which is modelled on the town meeting. Such countercultural themes gained traction in Western nations in the 1960s and 70s, particularly with the concerns over runaway technology. Here, Jacques Ellul's critique of autonomous technique as being a cold monster, and Lewis Mumford's critique of the mega machine are pertinent, with both of these figures frequently cited by primitivist thinkers. The ultra-left ideas developed or re-articulated in the 1960s, such as council communism, situationism, and autonomism, have also influenced the development of anarcho-primitivist thought, especially participation, the critique of inauthenticity, and the prioritization of continuous struggles by human beings against capital and atomization. So now that we've talked about these currents that lead into anarcho-primitivism, we are now with the anarcho-primitivists. So anarcho-primitivism arose in the 1970s as a response to the perceived failure of other contemporary leftist approaches to adequately question productivism, the notion of progress, the division of labour, and the seriousness of the environmental crisis. So this is important as the three most notable primitivist thinkers, Perlman, Kamat, and Zerzan, emerged from the established ultra-left milieus of councilism, Bordigism, and autonomism. While Kamat's thought was situated in the Bordigist camp for the greater part of the 1960s, he breaks with this tradition and also of Marxism more generally later in the decade over the question of organisation. So against the Bordigist emphasis on the party, Kamat developed a spontaneous and anti-substitutionist line. Just as a state is a gang mediating between particular capitals, he asserted, so too have all parties developed into gangs. For Kamat, all forms of authentic working class political organisation had disappeared and were replaced by various rackets which competed for theoretical and organisational prestige. As an illusory community, as he put it, the gang merely replaces all natural or human presuppositions with presuppositions which are determined by capital. And this process is linked by Kamat to capital's achievement of real domination. So here Kamat deploys Marx's distinction between the formal and real subsumption of labour under capital to develop a critique of capital's growing penetration into human existence. For Kamat, real subsumption entails the domestication of humans by capital, the autonomization of the non-living, and the progressive capitalization of everything. In this process, he says, capital becomes social, an animated monster seizing all the materiality of man. In short, he says, capital has become the material community of man. So breaking with Bordigism on the question of organisation, Kamat rejects all political representation as being a screen and an obstacle to a fusion of forces, and insists that emancipation must be self-emancipation based on materialist premises, which is the idea that consciousness is something which follows from action. So Kamat's work from the early to mid-1970s, while extending the above themes, argues that capitalism has now overcome the law of value, has been able to absorb crises, and, in a Debordian formulation, he contends that capital is today representation. Significantly, capital has finally negated classes through the universalization of wage labour, creating, he says, a collection of slaves of capital. He says that it is humanity that is exploited. So Kamat now suggests that the working class, as self-conscious collective actor, is inherently reformist, and here I will quote him. Doesn't Lenin's discredited statement that the proletariat left to itself can only attain trade union consciousness describe the truth about the class bound to capital? End quote. So proletarian struggle leads progressively to its integration of capital, and any appeals to parties, councils, or other forms of working class organisation as leading the way to communism are jettisoned as, in his words, mere coagulations of despotic consciousness. So Kamat also depicts the revolutionary reformism of the period 1913 to 1945 as a decisive stage in Marxism's failure. The convergence of the proletarian movement with the presuppositions of capital is characterized by him as follows. He says, we have the dichotomy of interior-exterior, the vision of progress, the exaltation of science, the necessity of distinguishing human from animal, with the latter being considered in every case inferior, the idea of the exploitation of nature. End quote. While Marx's own works, chiefly the earlier texts, continued to influence Kamat, Marxism was cast as unwittingly implicit in the domestication of humanity, as were other established left traditions and movements. And we see similar trajectories in the work of Perlman and Zerzan. In particular, they continue to extend the conceptualization of power, moving beyond a strictly class-centered approach to develop a broader notion of hierarchy, one that considers the elevation of the human over other living beings, and that encompasses questions of everyday life ignored by more orthodox Marxists and anarchists. This entails also the need for new modes of struggle, moving beyond, for instance, party-type organizations. And a significant ontological break also takes place here, centered on the formation of a system of domination that extends the story of lost innocence and contamination beyond the critiques of modernity found in Marxism and anarchism to points much further in the past. So these critical expansions beyond Marxist and anarchist leftism are developed by way of a few conceptual totalities. There's talk of civilization, Leviathan, and the mega machine. And there are echoes here of Engels' 1884, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, where the origins of class society, state, and gender inequality are located in the fall from primitive communism into settled agriculture. Anarcho-Primitivists radicalised this suggestion, introducing a number of crucial shifts in perspective, particularly with respect to questions of technology and nature. Kmart initially located humanity's domestication by capital in the period of what he called organised modernity, the time of social democracy, communism, fascism. In the 1970s, he pushes his periodisation back even further to a cycle beginning with the Greek polis and ending with the fall of the Roman Empire. And he then pushes it back to the advent of animal husbandry in the Neolithic Revolution, which is presented as a foundational moment for science, the treatment of the other as object, patriarchal, and capital. This I shouldn't put hard words like that in there. The exteriorization and instrumentalization of nature, underpinning humanism and scientism, necessitates for him a radical departure from domination over nature towards a reconciliation with and regeneration of nature. Tied to this line of argumentation is a critique of technology. Kmart rejects the notion that technology is neutral. Rather, it is intimately bound, he says, to the prevailing mode of production. And this critical optic is paired with a series of utopic suggestions for exiting the state of domestication. So urbanization is to be destroyed in favour of multiple dispersed communities. The transportation system is to be diminished and the division of labour to be changed. He calls for the suppression of monoculture and the mad population growth taking place at the time had to be reversed, he argued. Further, the somatic and psychological illnesses of present-day human beings, as he phrased it, are to be cured by a new active and unfixed life. And such transformations are urgent in part because of the pressures of environmental destruction, but also because of the ongoing diminishment of human communal essence in contemporary civilization. The goal of revolution for Kmart is to re-establish community, which was lost when ancient communities were destroyed. So the past here offers a means of conceptualizing a non-alienated, authentic, ecologically sound future. So similar emphases can be found in Zerzin's work. He locates the origin of alienation and the rise of civilization and advances an extremely stringent separation between nature and culture. He locates the genesis of domestication and domination not only in settled agriculture but also within culture writ large. Culture, he asserts, is the source of objectification of the real, of the ordering and manipulation of the wild. Culture is tied by Zerzin to symbolism and any other form of mediation, including language, numbers, time, and art. Culture, he says, is responsible for fragmentation and separation, the breakdown of wholeness, the end of communion with nature, distance from the immediate, and the division of labour. The earliest writing, for instance, is connected to taxation, law, and terms of labour servitude. And the appearance of art expresses an anxiety at being cut off from reality, the end of a way of life as it is instead a psychological compensation for the loss of identity. Zerzin's critique of culture is intimately bound to his position on technology. He writes that technology is, quote, the sum of mediations between us and the natural world and the sum of those separations mediating us from each other, end quote. Technology is another means by which real life is drained from the world and by which people have become infantilized and completely dependent upon machines. Much of Zerzin's work builds on this critique, drawing on the Frankfurt School in doing so to explore the various symptoms of a contemporary mass psychology of misery and hyper-alienation. So we have stress, loneliness, boredom, anxiety, the shrinking of the soul, and the spread of therapy and psychotropic drugs, which serve to further alienate us from our own experiences, he argued. So suspicion of technology and the notion of it being an independent protagonist is a commonplace of anarcho-primitivism. It is seen to enclose all other human activity, promoting rationality and artificiality. This is evoked in Perlman's notion of Leviathan and in the deployment of Mumford's term mega-machine by other Fifth Estate writers. Technology becomes a system, an autonomous power and social body, argues Watson. And as argued by Moore, technology is a product of a large-scale, interlocking systems of extraction, production, distribution, and consumption, and that such systems gain their own momentum and dynamic. So far from being neutral, technology has its own rationality and its own mode of being. The automobile, for instance, is not simply a tool, it is the totality of a system, a whole way of life, argued Watson. The technological mega-machine, in his estimation, undermines human independence, community, and freedom. It creates massified human beings, mystification, and control. A special place is reserved here for media technology due to its contribution to commodification and alienation. So in sum, the anarcho-primitivists radicalize and expand anarchistic critiques of power. Power relations are seen as pervasive and entrenched within all aspects of life. Civilization, as a conceptual object, encompasses state, private property, patriarchy, war, technology, and power relations more generally. It is associated with abstraction, separation, instrumental rationality, here I am on one of these lists again, mediation, fragmentation, mastery, hierarchy, objectification, and ordering. And it is only through dismantling civilization, it is argued, that humans can recover an enchanted unity of nature, meaning, dignity, and a harmonious community. So since civilization has separated humans from instinct, direct experience, intuition, and wildness in life, the dismantling of civilization entails major ontological and epistemological shifts. A total break from the core axioms of modern rationality and science is required to enact a re-enchanted unification of nature in these writers' work. For anarcho-primitivists, humanity can achieve a new innocence, spontaneity, or state of grace by moving from abstraction and rootlessness into a multivalent reconnectedness. To further explore these notions, we now turn from anarcho-primitivism's critical diagnostic towards its utopic dimension, as signalled in the primitivist side of the anarcho-primitivist equation. It is here that anarcho-primitivists have generated the most scorn. They're dismissed as a bunch of flakes and crazies who seek to turn the clock back and return us to the caves, propagating a romantic anti-modernism detached from both past and present realities. As indicated early, there are socialistic precedents for drawing from the past to think the historical actuality and future possibility of living otherwise. So the common historical reference we may come across here might be the democracy and expansive citizenship of Greek antiquity, or craftsmanship in the Middle Ages. But anarcho-primitivism draws us further back, into prehistory, to the period preceding the Neolithic Revolution, to the primitive communism or original anarchism of hunter-gatherer modes of life. It offers Edenic narratives influenced by anthropological work on hunter-gatherer and indigenous social orders. As Robinson and Tormey note, the mobilization of such anthropological work serves four major functions for anarcho-primitivists. The first is critique, demonstrating that capitalist statist social orders are not natural, universal, or inevitable. Such work denaturalizes the present, indicating other historically actualized modes of being. Second, this work encourages the utilization of techniques for sustaining stateless relationships, such as consensus forms of decision-making or sustainable human interchange with the natural world. Third, anthropological work brings greater reflexivity, questioning our preconceptions of primitive societies or indicating the perils of vanguardist politics. Fourth, this work generates solidarity, particularly of Indigenous peoples and struggles. So together these elements indicate that anarchism's future has either had a successful past actuality or is perhaps already here, present in micro-struggles and alternate ways of being together. So the anarcho-primitivist emphasis on the past presents difficulties, of course, for thinking revolutionary practice and strategy. It begs the question of how exactly we would set about dismantling civilization. The answer often lies in catastrophism, that the path to the future primitive passes through capitalist modernity's decadence and imminent environmental collapse. In the interim, primitivists champion living otherwise, creating new modes of life and struggle. And these modes of life are the inverse of anarcho-primitivism's critique of civilization. Here we see emphases on immediacy, non-hierarchy, community, reconnection, participation, rewilding, the human scale, and so forth. In an effort to head off critique, Future Primitive, Moore insists, is without precedent, rather than being a mere return, or as Becker suggests, the notion of future primitive keeps open the possibility that some of the advantages of civilization could be integrated into a culture that is guided by the deeper insights of primitive life. At times, though, primitivism's portrait of our culture of contamination appears to be so total that exit appears all but impossible. For example, Zerzan lambasted Fifth Estate for constantly appealing to a community that, at present, can only be negatively defined. In the absence of clear strategic deliberation, we are left, seemingly, with two options. The first is essentially eschatological, which is reliant on notions of decadence and approaching collapse, the awaiting of the primitivist Messiah. The second option is offered by Kamat. Anticipating objections, Kamat maintains his position is not fatalistic, and yet it is clear that Kamat's own question, how can destroyed human beings rebel, is a difficult one to answer following his break from Bordegism, which was at least able to lean on the party and working class. Kamat looks to the content of the new revolutionary cycle that opens with 1968 for answers. The leftist currents reinvigorated in that period are not what he has in mind, however. Instead, Kamat mentions youth who are not yet fully domesticated, and elements of the Third World that, in his words, have not yet fully succumbed to the despotism of capital. The possibility of communism appears, above all, as an existential hope, as an appeal to notions of human essence and refusal. Communism, he argues, is a necessity that extends to all humanity, and we must abandon this world dominated by capital, which has become a spectacle of beings and things, as he puts it. However, in a world of wandering, domestication, and damaged human material, are we not left with a rather forlorn faith in the individualized, purely ethical gesture of the rebellious subject, given that there is no clear subject materially propelled to become an agent of transformatory movement? While some figures in the anarcho-primitivist tradition have continued to produce work within this current, most notably Zerzan, others have moved on. Watson, for instance, argued in 1997 that anarcho-primitivism had become too excessive in its claims and too simplistic in its responses. Contemporary thinkers like Derek Jensen or Timothy Morton, who have much in common with this tradition, either take steps to distance themselves from anarcho-primitivism or disavow any connection at all. So while anarcho-primitivism is not on its own terms a strong intellectual current today, the issues it grappled with are very much at the fore. The acceleration of climate change, the ubiquity of pharmaceutic antidepressants and tranquilizers, the precarity of the global food supply, a society transfixed by its reflection in the Black Mirror, are all civilizational trends that require a robust critique. So the work of Franco Bifo Berardi, for instance, laments the alienation of the soul in work, decries pharmacological intensification, and asserts that mass shootings in the US are perpetuated by, as he puts it, the heroes of an age of nihilism and spectacular stupidity. Capitalism can only promise death, he says, with exodus through temporary autonomous zones towards communism the only path of escape. In a similar vein, the prominent ecofeminist Vandana Shiva, critical of the Enlightenment's fixation on scientific knowledge and economic development, calls for a decentralized approach to farming, a return to the small scale and to the organic. And James C. Scott's recent work Against the Grain offers what he calls a deep history of the state that echoes earlier anarcho-primitivist currents concerning the destructive qualities of agriculture, urbanism, the rise of the state, and the link that he draws between the domestication of nature and the domestication of humanity. Meanwhile, Sherry Turkle's groundbreaking research on the relationships of the self to technology paints a picture that conforms to the dystopic view of anarcho-primitivists, that our desire to connect with others through technology leads, perversely, to our disconnection and alienation from one another. Separation from each other, from the environment, the misery of Western civilization, unsustainable use of natural resources, runaway technology, the need to return to more authentic and localized forms of social interaction. Here, we can see that the concerns that animated anarcho-primitivists are as pertinent today as ever. So the work of Jensen draws these concerns together and extends them in a manner consonant with anarcho-primitivism, although he has a big ambiguous relationship with this tradition and has distanced himself from the term primitivism because, he says, it is a racist way to describe indigenous peoples. He prefers instead the label of indigenist because, he says, indigenous peoples have the only sustainable human social organizations. As with the anarcho-primitivist tradition, hatred of civilization is a persistent theme. Civilization, argues Jensen, is pervaded by dysfunctional and antisocial behaviors, is grounded in violence, and is completely irredeemable. To quote him, he says, "We need to bring down civilization now. We need not hesitate any longer. The planet is collapsing before our eyes, and we do nothing." End quote. Given the urgency of the situation, nothing is off the table. The contemporary activist scene is taken to task by Jensen for its cult of passivism, as he terms it. He says that violence needs to be seen as a legitimate part of any repertoire of resistance. But beyond dismantling civilization, where should such resistance take us? Since our culture is based on what Jensen calls human supremacism, which is the belief that humans are separate from and superior to everyone else on the planet, redemption lies, for Jensen, in rejecting the scientistic ontology of the West and learning from indigenous peoples. Such teachings, for Jensen, lead towards an identification of nature. Pretend you are the river, Jensen suggests. And he calls for the recognition of the intelligence and right to be of animals and their communities. On the back of such conceptual shifts ride more practical ones. And I'll quote from him here. Taking down civilization means acting. It means committing ourselves to defending our land bases, which means committing ourselves to removing the economic and transportations infrastructures, which means committing ourselves to hitting them and hitting them again and again and again. Once the economic and transportation infrastructures have been taken down, our fights over how to live sustainably in our land bases will be local and face-to-face, which means they will be human, which means they are eminently winnable through discourse or violence or some other means. End quote. So the dismantling of civilization, reconnection of nature, the return to the local and small scale, here lies for Jensen the only hope for life on the planet. Morton is another thinker whose recent work echoes the anarcho-primitivist tradition, although he never cites anarcho-primitivist thinkers. His latest work, Humankind, critiques left thought for not being open to the phenomenology of First Peoples, due to it being, as he puts it, fearful of primitivism, a concept which inhabits thinking outside agri-logistic parameters. End quote. So we've been trapped inside such thought parameters ever since what he calls the severing, which is his term for the foundational traumatic fissure that opened between humanity's reality and the real in the Lacanian sense of the term. the real here being the ecological symbiosis of human non-human parts in the biosphere. The severing, argues Morton, was instigated by the rise of Mesopotamian civilization. So the left, he argues, needs to reconnect with the symbiotic real, which involves achieving solidarity of non-humans, and he lists here such things as animals, clouds, objects, and ecosystems, and of entering into a state of nowness. Marxism, he argues, needs to embrace animism, a step that should not be dismissed as an appropriation of First Peoples cultures. If we drop the freight associated with the term primitivism, we move, with Morton, towards a reprise of the notion of the future primitive. Rather than an austere renouncement of the goods of a consumerist society, Morton calls for an ecstatic, joyful vision of communism. The change needed involves a deep ontological shift, the breaking of the inside-outside boundary of social space, which was established by the violence of post-Mesopotamian civilization. So Morton and Jensen offer arguably the two most productive contemporary approaches to the themes which had animated anarcho-primitivist thinkers, although we find resonances with these themes stretching across contemporary critical thought. While it is easy to dismiss anarcho-primitivism as an ultra-left curiosity, an extreme line of thought better left on the margins, it is our contention that this tradition forged important conceptual paths that the contemporary left will benefit from critically retracing. And so I move here, sorry I jumped over Morton, I'm moving here into my concluding remarks. So anarcho-primitivists offered a multi-stranded critique of civilization, holding that we had fallen from the innocence and grace of hunter-gatherer existence. And the fall is commonly dated to the time of the Neolithic Revolution, the foundational moment for private property, patriarchy, and the state. Central to this fall is a transformed epistemological and practical orientation. So we have critiques of separation, instrumentalization, and abstraction, which are tied to questions of science and the development of technique, which is seen as being far from neutral and tending towards autonomy and the enchainment of human beings. So technique is linked to the fragmenting division of labour and generalised disempowerment as human beings become ever more infantilized and dependent. Civilization is linked to patriarchy, militarism, conquest and genocide, and less drastically but just as destructively, civilization is implicated in homogenization and mass cultural conformity. Modernity intensified civilization's ill effects, forging damaged, controlled, spiritless and aggressive human material in its wake, generating mass murder and ecological devastation, multiplying unfreedoms, deadening conformity and domination. The alternative lies in the construction of future primitive social configurations, entailing reconnection with the natural world, decentralization, self-sufficiency, a simpler, less technologically mediated form of life and spiritual and intellectual re-enchantment. In critically engaging with this current, we have indicated the existence of a problem of agency, given primitivism's displacement of the working class and its strong reading of the total character of contemporary ideology. On the one hand, we might read anarcho-primitivism's narrative of the domestication, wandering, and hyper-alienation and mass misery as, above all, a political rhetorical strategy, something which aims to mobilize moral indignation and condemnation. On the other hand, primitivism's powerful negative hermeneutic, its account of humanity's fall, fails to match its frail positive hermeneutic, its extant utopian dimension. It is impossible, in drawing up a balance sheet of anarcho-primitivism, to ignore the vehement attack launched by Bookchin in the mid to late 1990s. Bookchin condemned primitivism for its withdrawal from the social domain into what he called lifestyle anarchism, a turning inward that ended up ditching enlightenment and reason and retreating into a romanticism that had reactionary, mystical, misanthropic, and even racist and fascistic tendencies. For Bookchin, primitivism was merely an expression of our times, rather than a solution to contemporary troubles. Nevertheless, there are elements worth salvaging, or at least meditating upon, within this extremist critique of civilization. As indicated, there remains a strong popular current of ambivalence about technological development, and the existentialist and communal being-centered notes sounded by primitivism are due something of a comeback. in opposition to the widespread dissatisfactions with the predominant liberal suspicions of commonality, of its obsessions with growth, profit, competition, and an individuality which is wholly conditioned by the market. It is here that anarcho-primitivist thinkers still have something to offer us after the prohibitions of the anti-essentialist and triumphant liberal moment. Thank you.